What if I told you that the guy who can't commit to anything, not a job, not a relationship, not even a damn Netflix series, isn't lazy or scared, but trapped in one of the most powerful psychological patterns Carl Jung ever identified? You know this guy. Hell, you might be this guy. He's charming, he's talented, he's got incredible potential, but somehow he's 40 years old and his life still feels like a rough draft. Jung called this the Puer Aeternus, the eternal boy, and it's destroying more men than porn, social media, and student loans combined. Here's what's going to piss you off. This isn't really about growing up. It's about growing into something. The Puer Aeternus isn't immature because he's stupid or lazy. He's immature because he's terrified of choosing one path over another, of committing to one life over infinite possibilities. And our culture has made this worse by selling us the lie that keeping your options open is smart, that commitment is a trap, that real men don't settle down. But Jung discovered something that changes everything. The eternal boy doesn't avoid responsibility because he's free. He avoids it because he's already trapped by his own patterns. By the end of this video, you're going to understand why some of the most gifted men you know are stuck in this psychological prison, how to identify if you're living a provisional life instead of a real one, and most importantly, Jung's blueprint for transforming eternal boyhood into conscious masculinity. This isn't about crushing your spirit or becoming some corporate drone. This is about accessing a kind of power that the man-child can't even comprehend, the power that comes from being someone others can truly count on. Stick around until the end because I'm going to share the one question Jung said every eternal boy needs to answer before real change becomes possible. And I guarantee it's not what you think. Look around you right now. In your office, your neighborhood, maybe even in your own mirror. You'll spot him, the guy who's technically an adult but still operates like he's waiting for someone else to handle the heavy lifting. We're talking about the Puer Aeternus, Carl Jung's term for the eternal boy, who's trapped in a psychological Peter Pan syndrome. This isn't about guys who enjoy video games or crack jokes. Hell, life's too short not to have fun. This is about men who've weaponized their boyhood as an escape hatch from the very responsibilities that would make them whole. You've seen this archetype everywhere, haven't you? He's the 40-year-old still living with his parents, not because life dealt him a rough hand, but because commitment feels like a prison sentence. He's the boyfriend who can't make plans beyond next weekend, the colleague who's still figuring things out after a decade in the same job. The Puer Aeternus has mastered the art of staying just charming enough to keep doors open while remaining just unreliable enough that no one expects too much. It's a brilliant strategy for avoiding disappointment, both giving it and receiving it. But here's where it gets interesting, and this is where Jung's psychological maturity insights really shine. The eternal boy isn't lazy or stupid. Often he's incredibly talented, charismatic, even brilliant. That's precisely the problem. His potential becomes his prison because it allows him to coast on what could be rather than commit to what is. He lives in the realm of endless possibility, where dreams stay safely protected from the harsh reality of execution. Every closed door represents another dream deferred, not another lesson learned. The modern world has made this masculine psychology phenomenon worse, not better. Social media feeds us a constant stream of highlight reels, making commitment to any single path feel like we're missing out on something better. Dating apps promise infinite options. Career platforms suggest we should always be open to new opportunities. The Puer Aeternus doesn't create himself in a vacuum. He's responding to a culture that's forgotten something crucial about personal growth. But what exactly has Jung identified as the psychological blueprint behind this eternal child? Carl Jung didn't just stumble upon the Puer Aeternus concept. He mapped it like a psychological archaeologist digging through the human psyche. According to Jungian psychology, this archetype represents a man whose psychological development got stuck somewhere between adolescence and adulthood, creating what Jung called a provisional life. Think of it as living in a perpetual rough draft, never quite ready to publish the final version of yourself. The eternal boy remains connected to the mother archetype in unhealthy ways, not necessarily his literal mother, but the psychological comfort of being taken care of rather than taking care. What makes Jung's analysis so damn accurate is how he identified the Puer Aeternus as someone who craves the heroic without accepting the mundane. These men dream of being the rock star, the entrepreneur, the artist who changes the world, but they can't handle the daily grind that actually builds those dreams. They want the masculine development without the discipline, the recognition without the responsibility. You'll notice they're always talking about their big break or their next move, as if life is just one audition away from perfection. Jung recognized this as a defense mechanism against the terror of ordinary commitment. But here's the psychological twist that Jung understood better than anyone. The Puer Aeternus isn't afraid of failure, he's afraid of success. Real success means you've committed to something long enough to see it through, which means you've accepted limitations. You've chosen this path over that one, this woman over others, this career over infinite possibilities. For the eternal child, that feels like death. Jung called this the provisional life because nothing ever becomes permanent, nothing ever becomes real. It's all just temporary until something better comes along. The archetypal psychology behind this runs deeper than most people realize. Jung identified that the Puer Aeternus often possesses what he called divine inflation, a secret belief that he's destined for something special, something that normal rules don't apply to. This isn't confidence, it's a psychological defense against the vulnerability of being ordinary. But what Jung discovered about the psychology behind this mask reveals something even more troubling about how this pattern develops. Strip away the charming exterior of the Puer Aeternus, and you'll find something that'll break your heart. A terrified little boy who learned early that vulnerability equals danger. Most eternal boys didn't just wake up one day and decide to avoid responsibility. They experienced something that taught them commitment leads to pain, that being needed means being trapped, that growing up means losing the only power they ever had, the power to leave. Maybe it was watching their parents' marriage implode, maybe it was being abandoned by someone they trusted, or maybe it was simply growing up in a world that demanded performance before it offered love. Jung understood that psychological maturity often gets derailed by what he called the wound of the son. This isn't just daddy issues, though that's often part of it. It's a deeper archetypal wound where the boy learns that masculine development means accepting a burden he's not sure he can carry. Look at how our culture presents adult male responsibility. It's all sacrifice, all pressure, all expectation, with very little celebration of the journey itself. The eternal boy looks at his father or other adult men and thinks, "Hell no, that's not for me." Can you really blame him? When was the last time you saw a movie celebrating a man who quietly, consistently showed up for his family year after year? But here's where the psychology gets really twisted. The man-child syndrome creates exactly what the eternal boy was trying to avoid in the first place. He wanted to stay free, but he becomes enslaved to his own immaturity. He wanted to avoid pain, but he creates it everywhere he goes. He wanted to keep his options open, but he ends up with fewer real choices than anyone. Personal growth becomes impossible because growth requires the very thing he's running from, the willingness to be accountable for outcomes, good or bad. The Puer Aeternus becomes a master of starting over because he never learned how to stick around and work through problems. The saddest part? These men often have incredible sensitivity and intuition, qualities that could make them exceptional partners, fathers, and leaders. But instead of integrating these gifts with mature responsibility, they use them as escape routes. They can sense exactly when relationships are getting serious, when jobs are demanding more commitment, when life is asking them to choose. That's when the eternal child does what he does best. He disappears, leaving behind a trail of people wondering what they did wrong. But this pattern of psychological avoidance creates a specific kind of chaos that affects everyone around them. Here's where the Puer Aeternus does the most damage, in his relationships and career, where his eternal child mentality turns him into a psychological wrecking ball. In romantic relationships, he's the guy who can sweep you off your feet for 3 months, make you feel like you're living in a fairy tale, then vanish the moment you start talking about moving in together. He's not intentionally cruel. That's what makes it so maddening. He genuinely believes he's protecting you from his own inability to commit. The man-child syndrome creates this twisted logic where abandoning people becomes an act of love. "I'm setting you free to find someone better," he'll say, as if his emotional unavailability is a gift rather than a cop-out. Professionally, the eternal boy is equally destructive, but in more subtle ways. He's often incredibly talented. That's how he keeps getting opportunities. But watch what happens when masculine development requires him to lead a team through a difficult project or stick with a company through its growing pains. Suddenly he discovers he's not passionate about this anymore, or he's ready for a new challenge. The Puer Aeternus has turned job hopping into an art form, always moving toward the next shiny opportunity rather than building something substantial where he is. His resume reads like a highlight reel of potential rather than a track record of achievement. What's particularly insidious about this pattern is how the eternal boy weaponizes his own sensitivity and creativity. In relationships, he'll use his emotional intelligence to identify exactly what you need to hear, then deliver it with Academy Award-winning sincerity. But psychological maturity isn't about saying the right things. It's about consistently doing them, especially when it's hard. In his career, he'll wow people with his vision and charisma during interviews, but when it comes to the daily grind of turning vision into reality, he's already mentally checking out. Personal growth requires sustained effort, and sustained effort feels like death to someone who's built his identity around infinite possibility. The most heartbreaking part, everyone around the Puer Aeternus can see his potential, his family, his friends, his romantic partners, his colleagues. They keep investing in him, believing that this time will be different, that he's finally ready to grow up. But Jungian psychology tells us something crucial about this dynamic. The eternal boy isn't struggling with commitment despite his potential. He's struggling with commitment because of it. His gifts become his prison, allowing him to coast on what could be rather than committing to what is. But there's a crucial distinction that most people miss when they're trying to understand this archetype. Here's where most people get confused about the Puer Aeternus. They think Jung was condemning all forms of youthful energy and playfulness in men. That's complete bullshit, and it misses the entire point of archetypal psychology. There's a massive difference between a man who maintains his sense of wonder, creativity, and joy, and a man who uses these qualities as an escape hatch from adult responsibility. Think about it. Some of the most powerful, successful men you know probably have a playful side. They can crack jokes in boardrooms. They're spontaneous with their families. They approach problems with curiosity rather than cynicism. That's not the Puer Aeternus. That's psychological maturity integrated with healthy masculine energy. The difference comes down to what Jung called conscious choice versus unconscious compulsion. A mature man chooses when to be playful and when to be serious. He can switch gears when the situation demands it. Watch him during a family crisis. He'll put aside his own comfort to handle what needs handling. Observe him in his career. He'll stick with difficult projects even when they're not fun anymore. The eternal child, on the other hand, is compulsively playful. He can't access seriousness when life demands it because seriousness feels like a betrayal of his core identity. Masculine development means integrating both sides, not abandoning one for the other. You'll see this distinction play out in how these men handle conflict. The psychologically mature man with a playful side will use humor to diffuse tension, but he won't use it to avoid addressing real problems. He understands that some conversations can't be joked away, that some situations require him to sit in discomfort and work through it. The man-child syndrome manifests as using humor as a weapon against intimacy. Every serious conversation becomes a comedy routine. Every attempt at depth gets deflected with a quip. It's not that he's funny, it's that he's terrified of being real. Personal growth requires the willingness to be unfunny, uncomfortable, and uncharming when the situation calls for it. The tragic irony. The Puer Aeternus actually loses his natural playfulness by clinging to it so desperately. Real playfulness comes from a place of security and confidence. When you know you can handle life's responsibilities, you're free to be genuinely spontaneous. But when you're using playfulness as a shield against adult demands, it becomes performative, forced, exhausting. The eternal boy ends up working harder to appear carefree than most men work to actually be responsible. But Jung identified a specific process that can transform this destructive pattern into something powerful. Carl Jung didn't just diagnose the Puer Aeternus problem, he mapped out the cure, and it's more badass than any superhero movie you've ever seen. Jung called it individuation, but I prefer to think of it as the ultimate hero's journey, where the eternal boy faces his greatest fear, becoming the man he's capable of being. This isn't about crushing your spirit or abandoning your dreams. It's about psychological maturity that integrates the best of your youthful energy with the power of conscious responsibility. The process starts when the man-child syndrome finally becomes more painful than the growth it's been avoiding. Usually this happens when life delivers a wake-up call so loud that even the most committed eternal boy can't hit the snooze button. The first stage of this masculine development journey is what Jung called the confrontation with the shadow. For the Puer Aeternus, this means looking honestly at the wreckage he's created, the relationships he's sabotaged, the opportunities he's wasted, the people he's disappointed. This isn't about self-hatred, it's about self-awareness. The eternal child has spent years crafting stories about why his failures weren't really his fault, why commitment is a trap, why he's different from everyone else. Jungian psychology demands that he shred those stories and face the truth. His pattern of avoidance hasn't protected him from pain, it's created more of it. Here's where the archetypal psychology gets really interesting. Jung identified that the Puer Aeternus has to go through what he called the death of the provisional self. This sounds dramatic because it is dramatic. The eternal boy has to let die the fantasy that he can live forever in the realm of pure potential. He has to accept that choosing one path means saying no to others, that committing to one woman means releasing the fantasy of infinite romantic options, that building one career means accepting the limitations of time and energy. Personal growth requires what feels like psychological death because, in a way, it is. The boy who could become anything has to die, so the man who will become something specific can be born. But here's what Jung understood, that most people miss. This death isn't really death, it's transformation. When the eternal boy finally commits to something real, a relationship, a career, a life path, he doesn't lose his essential nature. Instead, he gains access to a kind of power he never knew existed. The power that comes from sustained effort, from being someone others can count on, from building something that lasts. Jungian psychology suggests that the Puer Aeternus actually has incredible potential for this kind of transformation, because he's been storing up energy for years. But how exactly does this psychological metamorphosis happen in practical terms? Alright, let's get practical here, because understanding the Puer Aeternus is useless if you can't break free from it. Jung's archetypal psychology provides the blueprint, but you've got to do the actual construction work. The first step is what I call choosing your prison. Sounds harsh? Good, because that's exactly how the eternal child experiences commitment, as imprisonment. But here's the psychological maturity hack that changes everything. Instead of having commitment chosen for you by circumstances, you consciously choose your constraints. Pick one relationship to fully invest in, one career path to commit to for at least 2 years, one city to call home for more than a lease cycle. The man-child syndrome thrives on the illusion of infinite options, but masculine development begins when you deliberately narrow your focus. The second strategy is what Jung would call embracing the ordinary. The Puer Aeternus is addicted to peak experiences, the honeymoon phase of relationships, the excitement of new jobs, the rush of fresh possibilities. But personal growth happens in the valleys, not just on the mountaintops. Start celebrating small, consistent victories. Did you show up to work every day this week? That's heroic. Did you have a difficult conversation with your partner instead of avoiding it? That's legendary. The eternal boy is looking for life to feel like a highlight reel. But real men understand that greatness is built from 1,000 unremarkable moments of showing up when you don't feel like it. Here's the part that'll probably piss you off, but it needs to be said. You've got to start keeping your word, especially the small stuff. The Puer Aeternus has trained himself to believe that little commitments don't matter. I'll call you back in an hour becomes 3 days. Let's grab lunch next week becomes a text 6 months later. Jungian psychology tells us that how you handle small commitments predicts how you'll handle big ones. Your unconscious is always watching, always learning patterns. If you can't be trusted to return a text promptly, why would anyone believe you can be trusted with their heart, their business, their future? Start with tiny promises to yourself and others, then build up your commitment muscle like you're training for the Olympics. The final piece of breaking these Peter Pan chains is developing what Jung called active imagination around your future self. The eternal child lives in fantasy about what he might become, but he never does the psychological work of actually connecting with that vision. Spend time visualizing yourself at 50, 60, 70. What kind of man do you want to be? What kind of legacy do you want to leave? The Puer Aeternus avoids this exercise because it forces him to confront the passage of time, the reality of mortality, the urgency of choice. But this confrontation is exactly what transforms boyish dreams into masculine determination. Once you can see your future self clearly, you'll understand why every day you waste avoiding commitment is a day stolen from that man you're meant to become. And that leads us to the most sacred aspect of this entire transformation. Here's the truth that the Puer Aeternus has been running from his entire life. Responsibility isn't the enemy of freedom, it's the foundation of it. Jung understood something profound about masculine development that our culture has completely forgotten. The moment a man stops seeing responsibility as a burden and starts seeing it as a sacred privilege, everything changes. When you can genuinely say, "I've got this," and mean it, whether it's paying the bills, supporting your family, or building something meaningful, you access a kind of power that the eternal child can't even comprehend. This isn't about becoming some grim, joyless automaton. This is about discovering that true masculine energy comes from being someone others can count on, especially when the stakes are high. The psychological maturity that Jung described isn't just about individual growth. It's about understanding your role in the larger human story. Every Puer Aeternus thinks he's the main character in some epic adventure where normal rules don't apply. But archetypal psychology reveals something deeper. We're all supporting characters in each other's stories, and the quality of those stories depends on how reliably we show up for our roles. When you commit to being an excellent husband, you're not just making one woman happy, you're participating in the ancient dance of partnership that builds civilizations. When you commit to mastering your craft, you're not just advancing your career, you're contributing something valuable to the human project. Personal growth reaches its peak when you realize that your individual development serves something greater than your individual desires. The eternal boy is trapped in what Jung called psychological narcissism. Everything is about him, his needs, his dreams, his freedom. But the mature man discovers that his greatest fulfillment comes from being useful to something beyond himself. Maybe it's raising children who will change the world. Maybe it's building a company that solves real problems. Maybe it's simply being the guy in your community that people know they can count on. Jungian psychology suggests that this shift from self-focus to service focus is what transforms boys into men. But here's the beautiful paradox that Jung identified. When you stop running from responsibility and start embracing it consciously, you become more authentically yourself than you ever were as an eternal child. The man-child syndrome promised freedom but delivered only anxiety and emptiness. Sacred responsibility promises constraint but delivers genuine power, deep satisfaction, and the kind of respect that can't be faked or manipulated. The playfulness returns, but now it's earned. The creativity flows, but now it's channeled toward building rather than escaping. The charm becomes genuine because it's backed by substance. This is what it really means to grow the hell up, not abandoning your essential nature, but finally having the courage to express it through commitment rather than avoidance. So here's Jung's question that separates the eternal boys from the conscious men, and I want you to answer this honestly, right now. What are you so afraid of losing that you're willing to lose everything to protect it? For the Puer Aeternus, it's usually the fantasy of infinite possibility, the safety of never being truly seen or held accountable, the comfort of always having an escape route. But Jung understood that what we refuse to surrender voluntarily, life will eventually take from us by force. The man who won't choose commitment will find himself committed to nothing. The guy who won't risk being ordinary will discover he's become invisible. This isn't just psychological theory. This is your life we're talking about. Right now, today, you have a choice. You can keep living like a rough draft, always one rewrite away from the real thing, or you can start building something that lasts. Pick one relationship and go all in. Choose one path and walk it with intention. Stop treating your own life like a Netflix. Show you can pause whenever it gets uncomfortable. The masculine development Jung described isn't about losing yourself. It's about finally becoming yourself through the sacred act of commitment. But here's what I really want you to understand. This video is just the beginning. The archetypal psychology Jung developed goes deeper than most people ever explore, and there are specific strategies, mindset shifts, and practical tools that can accelerate this transformation from eternal boy to conscious man. If this content resonated with you, if you're ready to stop living provisionally and start building something real, then hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell. Let us know in the comments what commitment you're finally ready to make, whether it's in your relationship, your career, or just showing up consistently for your own growth. The Timeless Advice channel exists for men who are done with surface-level self-help and ready for the deep psychological work that actually creates lasting change. We're building a community of guys who understand that real strength comes from sustained effort, that true freedom comes from conscious choice, and that the best version of yourself is waiting on the other side of the commitments you've been avoiding. Don't let another year pass living like a boy in a man's body. Your future self is counting on the choices you make today.